Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to go through some notes that I did actually on my whiteboard. Honestly, I'm just trying to do something a little bit different, like mix it up a little bit. So I hope you don't mind. This is going to be a little bit different since they're set up as a picture library, but I will find a way to upload it so that you have the time to look through it at your own convenience. So let's see what my slideshow is going to do for us here. So, oops, too fast. Okay, Vietnam and Nation Divided is from chapter 22, section 3 of the textbook. And a lot of the information I'm giving you here is from that same section. So feel free to read it instead. If you don't want to listen to me, that's fine. Again, I'm just trying to mix it up a little bit and not make it so miserably boring, although I don't really know how handwritten notes on the board are any better, but it was just an idea I had. So on with the show, I guess. Vietnam, A Nation Divided, Chapter 22, Section 3. Here we go. So from the very beginning, something to point out that you maybe are already familiar with, we view World War II and Vietnam very differently. And by we, I mean even us, looking back historically, not to mention people that were the contemporaries of the veterans of World War II and the veterans of Vietnam. We really, those two wars have a different, um, a different, I can't think of the word, a different, they're viewed differently by the American public. There's countless like hero stories based on World War II. That even if the movie is sad, the Americans are painted as the victors, painted as the heroes, painted as the saviors. And Vietnam has a much more complicated legacy. Most of the Vietnam movies or documentaries that I can think of show a more conflicted outcome, that it's not just a straightforward, like, look at the American heroes. Although, of course, the veterans of Vietnam are heroes. I'm not trying to say that they're not. I'm saying the public narrative around the two wars feels a little bit different. And again, you can even think of something like Saving Private Ryan compared to, I can't think of the name of the movie. Shoot, Apocalypse Now. There we go. So some explanations of why we view World War II and Vietnam differently. Lots of differences here. There are different ideologies. If you think about the motivation of why we were fighting World War II, people perceive that we're fighting World War II to protect America and to keep America safe, to keep America strong, to make the world safe for democracy, so on and so forth. Whereas in Vietnam, the ideology behind it is really just to stop the spread of communism, to contain the spread of communism. So, in a sense, we are trying to keep the world safe for democracy, but it's a very different, perspective. World War II, we have countries that are actually going out of the bounds of their own country and committing acts of aggression against others, whereas in Vietnam, this is really a civil war that we're getting involved in. In World War II, this is a total war. This is something that affects civilians on a much deeper level. The mobilization for war, it changes jobs for millions of Americans. It changes lifestyles for people. People are growing victory gardens and collecting scrap metal and doing all these things to try to help the country. That's very different in World War II as opposed to Vietnam, where the war feels kind of detached. It's something that, you know, doesn't always dominate the everyday news cycle, at least not in the first half of the 60s. Now, when we get to like 67, 68, it becomes a major story in the news cycle, but, a different perspective early in the war, different economic landscape, considering that the United States had just come out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. World War II was really a way to ramp up the economy and to bring people back to the middle class and back to even greater prosperity. Whereas in the 1960s and especially the 1970s, the American economy looks a lot different. We have shifted already in the 1960s through away from the agricultural sector into the industrial sector, and already in the 60s and 70s, a growing service sector. So there's less, I guess, financial benefit for people in Vietnam, or well, Americans during Vietnam is what I should say. And that is something to consider as well. Um, then, honestly, there is a little bit of racism and prejudice, segregation, ideology still causing problems. The average soldier in the Vietnam War was more likely to be a minority, and the average Vietnamese citizen obviously was not that European ethnicity that the Americans had rushed to aid in World War II. So I think that that does play a role, whether we want to talk about it or not. The same idea with different culture, that people perceive that Vietnamese culture is quite different from the dominant American culture, whereas they might have felt that British culture or French culture or German culture, so on and so forth, was more similar. And maybe Americans had a little bit of a more challenging time connecting to Vietnamese citizens. The thing that I've got in the box there, different group of soldiers, that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. So what you need to know is that the average soldier in Vietnam was a little bit different than his World War II counterpart. So let me get to that. We're looking at different groups of soldiers here. Then and now, as in 2020 now, 18-year-old males are required to register with the Selective Service. Sorry, that looks a little weird, but the Selective Service is often known as the draft. So you are required when you turn 18 basically to sign up. I think you can do that online nowadays, but you can also do that through the post office, or I'm pretty sure at the DMV, like where you would get your license changed or renewed as well. Men between 18 and 26 could be called into service. So that is still true today. If we were to have a massive war, they could reinstate the draft, and then men 18 through 26 could be called into service. All of these things I'm saying could be because they would have to pass through Congress first. So it's a stopgap to make sure that the president doesn't just kind of declare war and send all these people off. In the 1960s and 1970s, during the period of Vietnam, the draft was active and open, meaning that any man between 18 and 26 could be called into service without like an act of Congress. Basically you would just get the letter in the mail and it's like, okay, it's your time to go. They also had during this time a draft. The early years of the war were just the typical draft that American soldiers had been going through for the previous like 20 or so years, that you get notified and kind of you don't have a whole lot of choice about it. And then as the war progresses, two things start changing. First of all, people find ways to quote unquote dodge the draft, but also that the system of drafting is a little bit different. So what we've got here, some of the ways to manipulate or dodge the draft: you could try to get a medical exemption, and a lot of people did. There were also a lot of people that were medically exempt that didn't want to be. They wanted to fight, and the military said no. The military gives medical exemptions for all kinds of things that you and I maybe wouldn't consider. First of all, obviously, any kind of like major physical handicap or mental handicap is going to restrict you from being drafted, but also things like nearsightedness in the 60s and 70s could have kept you from being drafted. I'm sure there's a medical term for it, but having flat feet, having flat arches, and that has to do with your ability to march, I guess. I don't know. But another large group of men signed up to join the National Guard or the Coast Guard, because the odds were that if you were in the National Guard or the Coast Guard, you were going to be staying in America to do your work and not be going to Vietnam, because you're specifically meant to protect the states and municipalities. So thinking back to what we learned about in other periods of the 60s, the National Guard was pretty active in fighting segregation and doing things to try to control riots and things like that. A lot of men were engaged in college deferment. So what that meant is if you were in college, you did not have to go into the military. And basically, the thought process is that we want you to be better educated. So if we think about, a person with a bachelor's degree, like what's their contribution to society going to be in the long term versus fighting the war, or somebody getting a master's degree or a doctorate or so on and so forth. Their contribution to the war in general versus society in general. The last option is just flat out dodging. So that is like going to Canada, going to Mexico, leaving the country, ignoring the summons when they sent it, just not showing up. There were some other things that people would do, maybe try to change your location, because all these different locations have what we call draft boards. So they were a group of people that you would go before to try to explain why you shouldn't be drafted. And honestly, then as now, there are groups of people that are more sympathetic, or like, I don't want to say would take a bribe, but like maybe you could convince them, to look the other way if you were going to do a certain thing. There's lots of unique examples of people doing this. But all of those things that I wrote up on the board there are examples of what today might be called white privilege. And I'm certainly not saying that all of the people that did any of this were white. And I'm not saying that all the people that had medical deferments, were intentionally dodging the draft. Again, many people were told they couldn't serve but wanted to. What I am saying is that if you were able to pay for college, you're probably more middle class, you're maybe more upper class. If you were able to get a congressman or a senator to move you up the waiting list for the National Guard, probably a more middle class to upper class person. If you had the money and the means to dodge the draft by leaving the country, probably a more middle to upper class person. Some of the medical deferments, again, were made through bribery, which would imply probably a medical or upper class, middle or upper class person. So it's not to say that it was only a middle or upper class problem, but more likely a middle or upper class solution to the problem. And that's just something that, people were criticizing at the time, and people still studying the Vietnam War today would criticize as well. 80% of the soldiers on the ground in Vietnam were low income, and I'm sorry, the M looks really super weird. I can't do a bubble letter M, apparently. But that's a big change from World War II. So remember, they're coming off of the Great Depression, so lots of people are low income. But I think the difference is that there was less income disparity, these huge gaps between like really wealthy, middle class, and low income soldiers. And that's a big difference, again, from World War II, that, in general, society is like certainly less wealthy than it would be in the 60s and 70s. Many soldiers during the Vietnam War were African American, which caused frustration, because that they were facing a lot of discrimination in America. We say that 1965 is kind of the big year in Vietnam. Like, we ratchet up the number of people that are going to serve. Think about what we've learned about with civil rights, the March on Selma, the March on Washington, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then we touch briefly on massive urban riots that started in 1967, really in 1968. People are feeling frustrated, like, why should we go to war and fight for this country when you don't want me to live in your neighborhood? You don't want my kids to attend your schools. You don't want my kids to ride the same bus as your kids. You're not treating us like first class citizens in America. So why should we go and fight and die for you in Vietnam? Especially because the numbers of deaths were disproportionately high for African Americans. And I can't remember the numbers, I didn't write them down, but it was something like African Americans were maybe 20% of the fighting force in Vietnam and like 30% of the deaths, something like that. So it was disproportionately high. Additionally, more than 10,000 women served in non-combat roles and faced many challenges while doing so. As you can imagine, women were not really working alongside men as much as possible. And when they were in Vietnam, they were facing all kinds of discrimination and sexism. And we talk about even today that, women facing sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military is still a major problem. So you can imagine what it would have been like in the 60s and 70s in a jungle halfway around the world. There was some opposition to the war, just like any war, from the Revolutionary War to the war in Afghanistan. There is going to be opposition to every war, but Vietnam is the first time we really see massive, wide-scale opposition to the war. So we've got two major groups: the New Left and then campus activists. The New Left, they're calling themselves the New Left in comparison to the old left, if you will. The old left is the like FDR Democrats, of kind of socialist Democrats that we want to help society and do all these things to benefit society. And so they're calling themselves the New Left to draw a line and say, we're not like the Democrats or the liberals of the past. And then campus activists, as you can imagine, primarily college students, but also some high school campuses as well, and then just other young adults throughout society. As I mentioned, there were widespread protests, widespread disagreement with the war. So on the previous slide, you saw SDS and FSM. SDS stands for Students for a Democratic Society. Their goal is actually to stop large government and corporate influence, and they see the war as a reflection of both large government and corporate influence. I think I've mentioned to you guys that war can be a way to make a lot of money. So, there's always benefits and costs to a war like any other economic decision. And you have to think about, who's paying the cost and who's reaping the benefits. And I think SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, they're kind of calling that out. They lead multiple marches on Washington and on college campuses across the country. They are bolstered by those in FSM, the free speech movement. Name pretty much implies their goals, that they believe that people should have unrestricted free speech. They don't believe that people should be restricted on like unpleasant speech, I guess is the way I would describe it. That people should be getting the full facts about Vietnam and about other things. Nothing should be censored. Keep in mind, this is, I don't know, within 2 to 3 years after Lenny Bruce, if you've ever heard of him. Lenny Bruce is a famous comedian that was being arrested constantly for talking about sex and cursing and talking about drugs and stuff in his comedy skits. So American society in the 60s is much, much more restricted than you might think. A lot of people want to know, why is America involved in a civil war across the world? Why did we choose to get involved in that war when there are so many issues that are plaguing us at home in terms of race relations, in terms of income inequality? There are still very, very poor people in rural communities around the country. Thinking about changing women's roles, changing just society in general. It's a time of great upheaval. And so, again, many people are asking, why aren't we focusing on issues within America instead of a civil war across the world? Protest over time becomes actual resistance to the war. So think about, okay, protest is speaking out and saying, I don't like this, I disagree with this, I'm going to picket, I'm going to, I don't know, sign a petition or something. Whereas resistance is more action based, that you're going to actively say no when you're being drafted, that you're going to actively refuse to support the war and support those that support it. So it's kind of a changing means of protest into, again, more actionable items rather than just, after work today, I'm going to go protest because I'm angry. By 1967, anti-war sentiment is growing across all sectors of society. So even what Richard Nixon refers to later in the 70s as the silent majority, kind of the middle class, middle age, Like, I'm gonna just sit in the background. I'm not actively protesting. People are getting angry across all sectors, and there's lots of causes of the anger. Some people are angry at young people for rejecting the war. Some people are angry at older people for forcing the war on them. There's discontent among the races, discontent among the economic groups, discontent among the sexes. I mean, lots of issues going on in the late 60s. There are major protests held in 1967 at Central Park and at the Lincoln Memorial. Central Park, obviously, in New York City. The Lincoln Memorial is in Washington, D.C. If you have seen Forrest Gump, the fictionalized scene where Forrest is yelling for Jenny in the Washington Monument, or I'm sorry, the Lincoln Memorial, the reflecting pool in front of it, that is an example of a major protest that was held against the Vietnam War in 1967. It's obviously fictionalized, but the protests are real. The anger is real. The feeling that people are dealing with is real. There are two main groups in society: the doves that think that the war should end. Doves are meant to be peaceful, symbol of peace, that they're ready for the war to end, and at the very least ready for Americans not to be a part of it, as opposed to the hawks that maybe they don't literally say more guns please, but they want the war to continue. They want to see it through, stay the course, all these things that we hear. Hawks are perceived to be more aggressive. They will attack other animals, and doves we don't really think of in that way. So doves and hawks become symbolic of people that want peace pretty much at any cost versus hawks that want victory at any cost. Just like anything else in life, just like COVID-19 and all the craziness going on right now, there are these two groups, the doves and the hawks, but it leaves out all the people in the middle that are like, I'm not really sure what I think. I don't know if I think that it's right or wrong, or maybe they're a little bit of both, and they don't see a clear-cut answer. Most people kind of operate in that gray area of I don't know exactly what the right thing to do is. So just keep that in mind. We like to be able to say, here's this box and here's this box and we're done and we move on. But the reality is a lot messier than that. The reality is that there are people all over the map, all over the spectrum. So please keep that in mind. Most Americans feel mixed emotions. As late as 1967, 70% of Americans felt that war protests were an act of disloyalty. So at the very least, I think people felt, how are you going to demonstrate against soldiers? How are you going to make people think that, these things are wrong? How are you going to make them feel like their sacrifice was wrong? I have heard mixed stories that, that if you're a student of history, you might have heard that people supposedly spit on the Vietnam vets that were returning, that they would boo them, that they would picket at the airport and curse at them and all these things. I have heard that that was true. I have heard that that was not true. And in my grad school experience, one of my last classes, we had online learning just like this, and the professor was going on and on about how it wasn't true, and one of the men in the class was a Vietnam vet that said it happened to him. So I don't know, but I do know that a lot of Americans were upset when other Americans were protesting the Vietnam War. So like I said, a lot of people feel kind of mixed emotions, stuck in the middle somewhere. The year 1968 is going to change everything for Vietnam and everything for American society. So I'm going to leave you with a cliffhanger to be continued. Wait on the edge of your seats, and I will be back soon to tell you the rest of the story.